So that.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I know that today is a holiday here in France, and thanks for spending these hours here with us. So thank you very much for the invitation to ULIS in New York and also to the Independent Institute of Philosophy. And many thanks to this association. This is Dmitry Shostakovich's association, so for hosting this event here. My topic is quite different from what we've heard so far. It was really very interesting presentation, and obviously the message itself, so it's close to heart. Listen to yourself, reflect upon your own experiences, think for yourself. So actually this is the message that we read in Kant's What is Enlightenment? So this is really a very old message, and it's very true message. And one of the core of these messages is to reflect upon oneself, upon one's own experiences, and also upon what one observe around the world. So my topic today is Russian anti-progressivism in its origins. And this is also a sort of reflection. So another kind of reflection is a reflection upon what is going on in Russia today, and also upon the sources, the origins. Yeah, so and this is origins not only or not necessary merely historical origins, but also intellectual origins of the atrocities that Russia conducts in Ukraine right now. In his recent book, Russia Against Modernity, the historian and cultural theorist Alexander Etkind has argued for Russia's, how he calls it, stop modernism, claiming that, I quote, the war exposed the incompetence and anti-modern predilections of Russia's rulers better than the public sphere ever could. The war in question is obviously the war in Ukraine. While it's hard to ignore the rise of anti-modern sentiments in contemporary Russia, and while the aggressive promotion of so-called traditional values is just the tip of the iceberg of anti-modern propaganda, what we observe in Russia today is not just an attempt to stop modernism, as Alexander Etkind says, or to discard modernity as a distinct condition of the contemporary world. Rather, these and other apparent phenomena are symptoms. It seems that there is a more fundamental problem than is readily apparent, namely Russia's resistance to progress, deeply ingrained in its historical trajectory, political structures, and cultural values. The hostile assault on Ukraine's embarking upon its path of modernity starkly manifests Russian anti-progressivist tendencies in its most ominous form. Thus, the question worth examining is what may be responsible for Russia's persistent adherence to archaism and apparent anti-progressivism. While many various factors have contributed to this development, I would venture to suggest that a key cause is associated with Russia's largely elusive and unfulfilled enlightenment. Contrary to its European counterpart that arguing for progress gave rise to modern values, innovations, and social changes, the Russian Enlightenment championed traditionalism, promoting it as a dominant state ideology. As a cultural and societal orientation advocating the preservation and continuity of a particular set of values said to be deeply rooted in national history and heritage, Russian traditionalism then became a key source of the resistance to the advances of the European Enlightenment. After a brief examination of peculiarities of the Russian Enlightenment, in this talk, I will explore how traditionalist concerns manifested in Russia's subsequent history, focusing mainly on two periods: the 19th century, marked by its profound search for Russian identity, and the present period, with its renewed emphasis on tradition and traditional values. In conclusion, I will also comment on counter-Enlightenment tendencies evident in contemporary Russia and show their connection to the traditionalism that the current regime instrumentalizes to promote its anti-progressivist agenda. First, briefly about the phenomenon of Russian Enlightenment in the context of its European counterpart. The Enlightenment age in Europe is usually dated from 1680 to 1789, with the French Revolution of 1689 marking the culmination of its vision, the overthrow of old authorities, and the reshaping of society according to rational principles. The period witnessed profound cultural transformation in Europe, driven by rigorous exploration of reason and its application to all aspects of human agency. Fueled by an entirely new philosophical spirit, the most radical proponents of the Enlightenment, French humorists, widely known as philosophers, and the Central European Aufklärer, saw their goal in bringing light to a benighted intellectual landscape, how they put it. The main achievement of the European Enlightenment is a normative idea of liberalism manifested in the declaration of the intrinsic value of each individual and respect for human dignity. When the Enlightenment descended into the bloody terror in the aftermath of the French Revolution, it also revealed the limits of its own ideas. Nonetheless, liberalism and enlightened rationality, characterized by a spirit of self-criticism, creativity, social and political transformation, as well as the enhancement of humanity, gave rise to modernity. This new era embraced the Enlightenment's liberal ideals, enshrining them in widely adopted principles of morality and human rights, and actively applying them to social and political affairs, including representative constitutional law. The extent to which this brief account of the Enlightenment project directly applies to the history of Russia is a contentious issue in its own right. Even those who are willing to acknowledge that, like its European neighbors, Russia was significantly influenced by the Enlightenment, cannot reach a consensus regarding the chronology of this period. Here, I will rely on the prevalent historiography concerning this matter, aligning myself with scholars who recognized the presence of a distinct Enlightenment era in Russian history, dating it to a century-long and mostly continuous period from 1689 to 1796, effectively beginning with Russia's emergence from its medieval period, which approximately coincided with Peter I, Peter the Great, assumption to power in 1694. It was a time of rigorous modernization, which affected virtually all areas of domestic affairs and many aspects of everyday life for the population. However, the Russian Enlightenment demonstrated a great degree of moderation compared to its European counterpart, particularly in its radical French form. This moderation resulted from several important features of the Russian version of the Enlightenment that determined outcomes of this period and its impact on subsequent development of the country. Unlike France and Central Europe, where the Enlightenment was a project led by Lumières and Aufklärer, initiated and carried out by intellectuals themselves, in Russia, the task of enlightenment was taken up by monarchy, the state, and the Orthodox Church. In this top-down setting, a radical enlightenment movement was unfeasible. The state and official church collaborated to achieve their primary objectives of preserving autocracy and further strengthening their power. They introduced reforms which neither posed a challenge to this power nor permitted any actions that could jeopardize it. This first restrictive feature of Russian Enlightenment determined another peculiarity, an almost entire lack of a free public sphere. Until at least the second half of the 18th century, the public space or public sphere in Russia was effectively monopolized by the church and the state, with their influence extending to press control, including ownership of the publishing houses, publication of newspapers, etc., and domination of intellectual and cultural discourse, initially in the Tsardom and later in the empire. Even if the public sphere expanded later and other actors entered the scene, for example, the appearance of the first private journals, as well as the increase of intellectual activity stimulated by Elizabeth's reforms, it continued to be closely monitored and strongly censored. During the reign of Catherine I, the famous Catherine the Great, often regarded as the most enlightened Russian monarch, a close eye was kept on the public sphere, and any perceived threat to autocracy and the emperor's power was swiftly quashed. Notable examples include Catherine the Great's campaign against free masonry, so Masons, which she launched after 1785, and the arrest of publicist Nikolai Novikov in 1792 and writer Alexander Radishchev in 1790, both of which readily authorized. So the politics aside, the Russian Enlightenment is usually viewed as a significant period illuminated by the ideas of knowledge and learning. And its achievements are primarily associated with educational initiatives and advancement in the basic sciences. However, while from the very beginning, the Enlightenment project in Russia was widely perceived as an endeavor to illuminate minds and encourage the formation of an educated population, education was rarely conceived as an end in itself. The ruling elites rather saw it as a means for inculcating obedience to monarchy and Christian piety. Thus, in Russia, the Enlightenment educational program consisted of two connected elements. So first, establishing public education, and second, cultivating in countrymen native virtues that encourage loyalty to the court and church. The realization of this second goal of instilling obedience was seen as the development of a people deeply rooted in traditional values, practices, and religious beliefs, fostering a sense of belonging, to borrow Gadamer's terminology, to the distinctly Russian cultural heritage. Despite the Russian Enlightenment's connection to its European counterpart, the Russian version not only had different goals and objectives rooted in a desire to maintain the existing social and political status quo, it promoted established traditional norms and practices, including religious beliefs, customs, those perceived the most stable and effective for preserving autocracy. This development had two main implications. First, Russia failed to seize the moment to embark on a path of progressive advancement towards genuine national enlightenment, and instead continued faltering in this economic, social, political, and cultural development. Russia's tradition of absolutism and the institution of serfdom proved inimical to the European Enlightenment, especially to the liberal ideas and principles it exhibited. Second, hostile to liberalism and resistance to significant social and political changes as disruptive to the established order and values, the Russian Enlightenment championed traditionalism, promoting it as the dominant state ideology. Autocratic absolutism, the unquestionable authority of the Orthodox Church, and ambivalence among rulers erected significant barriers to Russia's productive adoption of Enlightenment ideals. These factors also represented key sources and elements influencing Russian traditionalism. While the origins of the social, political, and social cultural ideology can be traced back to the medieval period, Russian traditionalism began gaining prominence in the 18th century and became a dominant force in Russia's intellectual discourse and political landscape in the 19th century, when it gave rise to Russian ethno-nationalism, anti-Western sentiment, and messianic exceptionalism. Embracing the commitment to preserve and safeguard Russia's historical, religious, and cultural heritage, this evolving ideology emerged as a primary obstacle to advancing enlightenment in Russia. It nurtured resistance to radical change, upheld conservative values, and stifled extensive social, cultural, and political innovations. It is somewhat ironic that today, more than 2 centuries later, the current Russian ruler is invoking traditionalism, making it instrumental to his war against Western liberal values and civilizational progress, precisely the ideals and values that the European Enlightenment affirmed and advanced. Noticeably, Putin's current outlook on Ukraine exhibits key tenets of this traditionalist attitude. The so-called special military operation launched on February 24, 2022 is said to aim at liberating the hapless Ukrainians from their Nazi government and freeing them from the constraints of the liberal international order. Putin's regime conceives of the people of Ukraine as having been brainwashed by hostile West, the enemy of choice in a long-standing narrative and the primary source of Russia's current sense of victimhood after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Contrary to what is widely suggested, though, this narrative did not first emerge from under the ruins of the Soviet Union. Its roots can be traced back to what is often referred to as the Russian question, which is associated with debates and discussions about the national identity and historical mission of Russia. One of the first and most powerful voices was Pyotr Chadaev's, whose experience in the West made him aware of Russia's backwardness in political, economic, and cultural affairs. In his first philosophical letter, 1829, he presented a devastating critique of Russia and its history. Many debates about Russia's position in Western modernity can be traced back to Chadaev. His great significance lies not only in shaping Russian intellectual discourse, but also in bringing attention to the critical need of self-examination. He placed the Russian question at the center of intellectual debates in Russia, where this question received its specific shape as part of the search for Russian identity. It has since reverberated consistently throughout Russian intellectual discussions, framed in a variety of approaches and pursuits, with the quest for a national idea and tradition in all its combination and derivative emerging as a central concept in this endeavor. The 19th century provides plenty of examples of this development. Contrary to the previous century, which even if limited but inspired by the European Enlightenment and influenced by the West, 19th century Russia broke away from its Western leaning. This signified Russia's fundamental shift toward the most dogmatic form of cultural and historical traditionalism, which was elevated to an official creed of the Russian state in its attempt to resist Western influence and became accepted within society as a dominant worldview. In the early 19th century, Nikolai Karamzin insisted in his memoir of Old and New Russia, written in 1811, that the Russians should not attempt to imitate the West, but rather should maintain the beliefs of their ancestors. According to him, I quote, "An Orthodox Russian was the most perfect citizen and Holy Rus, the foremost state in the world," end of quote. Expressing anti-Western sentiments, he praised the era when Russians successfully resisted the influence, how he put it, of the savage horde of Europe and showed courage to call Europeans infidels. Continuing the trend, about 2 decades later, in 1833, Count Sergei Uvarov, serving as the Minister of Education for Tsar Nikolaus I, declared, I quote, "Our common obligation consists in this, that the education of the people be conducted in the joint spirit of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. It is necessary to establish," he wrote, "our fatherland on firm foundations upon which is based the well-being, strength, and life of a people. It is necessary to find the principles which form the distinctive character of Russia and which belong only to Russia. It is necessary to gather into one whole the sacred remnants of Russian nationality and to fasten to them the anchor of our salvation," end of quote. Inspired by the Christian Trinity, whose strength lies in unity, Uvarov's three principles, orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, initially introduced to infuse a national spirit into educational reforms, soon extended beyond educational affairs to become a fundamental creed of Nicholas I's Russia as a whole. In his effort to counter Western European liberalism and emphasize Russian distinctiveness, Nicholas I exploited the emerging sense of romantic nationalism, largely influenced by German Romanticism, which had captured the interest of Russian intellectuals. This exploitation served to promote the most reactionary chauvinism and bolster his oppressive regime. The triad that essentially summarized the ideological outcomes of the Russian Enlightenment has enthroned traditionalism as a national ideology of Russia, propagating so-called doctrine of official nationality. For decades, this formula of official nationality worked effectively, justifying and strengthening the Russian monarchy and furthering its obsession with power and status. It also left its mark on Russian intellectual discourse and influenced the development and choice of topics in 19th century Russian philosophy. Discussions regarding Russia's identity became dominant, reaching their peak in the contentious debate between two conceptually opposed intellectual streams, Slavophiles and Westernizers. In this dispute, Russian traditionalism emerged as one of the most powerful arguments used by Slavophiles. A significant practical motivation among Slavophiles was the desire to comprehend and define what is often referred to as the Russian spirit, as well as to foster the spread of a Russian national identity in the multinational Tsarist empire. The philosophy of Slavophilism as a well-established theory surfaced in the 1830s. However, as a distinctive worldview, it existed in the national and social consciousness long before it was crystallized in public doctrines. Peter the Great unconsciously awakened this latent, unexpressed Slavophilic feelings in Morse when he enticed leaders of Western European industry to follow his trail to Moscovia and regenerate on Russian soil. The Slavophiles emerged as the champions of Russian traditionalism, embracing everything typically associated with it. They declared that Russia possessed true freedom, faith, and brotherhood, qualities lacking in the Western neighbors. Russia, according to the Slavophiles, boasted an ancient and splendid heritage of communal life and a land system where the inherent justice of the Russian peasant's heart was exemplified through the voluntary and brotherly division of land among fellow countrymen. While the Westernizers believed in an integral worldview and a unified vision of historical progress as the essential framework to theorize Russia's legacy and destiny, the Slavophiles aimed to promote Saburnist, Russian traditional spirituality. They regarded it as a unique Russian identity and the only means of escaping Western decadence. In Russian, the term Saburnist means togetherness or spirit of communality. It has theological origins and connotations representing the spiritual experience of religious faith in its purest form, namely Russian Orthodoxy. The Slavophiles insisted that this Orthodox spirit of organic togetherness, uncontaminated by Western rationalism and immorality, is the only model for Russian society and should also become an ideal for all of the humanity. In their ideas and theoretical doctrines, the Slavophiles not only invoked the spirit of traditionalism, but also made it the ideological foundation of their aggressive Russophilism. That the Slavophiles laid the philosophical foundations for a distinctly Russian tradition of culture and religious messianism, encompassing figures like Fyodor Dostoevsky, especially his political writings, the Pan-Slavic and Eurasian movements, and the apocalyptic vision of Nikolai Berdyaev. The messianic character of this Russian intellectual tradition is now widely accepted, but many overlook its most fundamental feature, its inherent counter-enlightenment and traditionalistic nature. While the Slavophiles made substantial contributions to the development of an aggressive Russophile mentality bordering on messianic exceptionalism and Russian ethno-nationalism, their ideas gained even more significance and prominence decades later through the efforts of various thinkers sympathetic to the messianic Russian idea. Also, prophetism was a characteristic feature of many writings by the Moscow Slavophiles. It took on a more demanding form in the text of later non-Slavophile philosophers such as Vladimir Solovyov, Sergei Bulgakov, and Nikolai Berdyaev, as well as various Russian literature. Despite differences in their initial intentions and the diversity of claims they presented, they all appeal to Russian tradition as a repository of true Christian spirituality and ideal moral values. They juxtaposed to it the decadent, how they put it, Western morality, which they deemed corrupted by reason, heretical disbelief, and the lack of religious spirituality. They used traditionalism, specifically Russian archaic tradition, to assert the primacy of generalization and unification as tools for the religious and historical transformation of reality. Despite being introduced and developed under various names such as соборность, целостность, wholeness or integrality, всеединство, all unity, Solovyov, Vladimir Solovyov's term, universal Christianity, national unity, national identity, etc., the fundamentally traditionalist idea, albeit in different ways, promoted the old ideals established during the Russian Enlightenment and preserved in Nicholas I's triadic formula of the official nationality. These ideals proved to be extremely durable in Russian history, eventually leading to idiocracy and totalitarianism in the first half of the 20th century. No matter how paradoxical it may appear, the ideas of Bolshevik and Soviet Russia were inherited from the Russian Empire. The cunning communist ideologists took Nicholas I's slogan and simply modified it. Orthodoxy was replaced with Marxism, later Marxism-Leninism, autocracy with the communist leaders' iron rule, in earlier and later versions slightly modified as the rule of the Communist Party, and nationality, народность, remained in place. For more than 7 decades of the Soviet regime, the firm control exerted by resilient leaders served as the prevailing force shaping life in the multinational empire. The envisioned historical social project, communism in its design, aimed to unify the people and instill a sense of national pride and self-respect. However, it proved unsuccessful, ultimately leaving the country's population in a state of dismay. Furthermore, while the Soviet regime prided itself on developing a unique Russian culture established behind the Iron Curtain, it persisted as a prison culture, contributing to widespread apathy and civic disengagement among people. Thus, it is not surprising that in the aftermath of the 20th century, the Russian populace became even more averse to progress, unwilling to push for change, favoring instead traditionalism and conformity. One doesn't need to be a Russia expert to recognize how the emerging order under Putin's regime echoes the darkest periods of Russia's history. This is not only reflected in grim new era of repressions, and heightened punishment for opposition figures, but it also evident in Putin's dictatorial control, the close collaboration between the state and the Russian Orthodox Church, the ongoing True Patriots campaign, and a significant emphasis on extreme ethno-nationalism and Russia's perceived exceptionalism and supremacy. While today's regime may use a slightly different vocabulary, the core ideas it endorses and the principles it invokes in its propaganda remain unchanged. The Russian question has resurfaced in the public agenda, but now in a more aggressive manner. Its ugly manifestations are apparent both inside and outside the country. Internally, in the rise of radical right conservatism and ultranationalism, and externally, in the brutal war in Ukraine with an attempt to dismantle an independent state and reshape the world order. Putin and his regime framed the war and the current confrontation with the West as, how he puts it, an existential battle for the survival of Russia and the Russian people. The endeavor to elevate the Russian question into a significant ontological issue is not a new concept and did not originate with Putin. In recent history, it was Alexander Solzhenitsyn who, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, declared that what is now at stake for Russia is the survival of the Russian nation. In his short 1994 book titled The Russian Question at the End of the 20th Century, Solzhenitsyn poses a direct query. I quote, "Shall our people, Russians, be or not be?" This is his question. In his endeavor to address this question, he turns to history, recounting Russia's narrative over the past 4 centuries. He doesn't hide his preferences, revealing his fondness for the final decades of imperial rule and portraying it as a paradise lost for the Russian Empire and the Russian nation. As a fervent opponent of communism, he attributes most, if not all, of the troubles afflicting the Russian nation to Soviet ideology and practice. In his view, progress means a return, not merely to pre-Soviet time, but rather to the deeper roots. Solzhenitsyn calls on the Russian people to return to their spiritual heritage as the most steadfast foundation for the revival and unity of the nation. This argument, even in a slightly modified form, persists today. There is nothing inherently problematic with appeals to spirituality and traditions. They can indeed promote national unity, especially in times of change or uncertainty. However, the ideological instrumentalization and political manipulation of traditions have led to dangerous results throughout Russian history, resurfacing today in a no less troubling form. Indeed, if today the Kremlin promotes anything resembling an official ideology, it is the Russians' proclaimed capacity to uphold the traditions passed down by their ancestors and to embrace Orthodox spirituality. Putin's regime presents this as a new strategy, invoking it as Russia's geopolitical weapon in its fight against Western outright Satanism, how they put it, supposedly manifested in a, quote, radical denial of moral norms, religion, and family. However, what is portrayed as new is not at all new. It is a centuries-long Russian traditionalist agenda with its archaic assertion of religious and traditional values that Putin glorifies as the embodiment of great historical Russia, his quote. There is, however, a significant novelty evident in the present-day utilization of this well-known agenda. Its present uses extend beyond local boundaries, transcending the realms of confrontation between individual nation-states of cultural regions. At stake is a global ideological clash between liberalism and traditionalism. In this assertive encounter, Russia is portrayed as a stronghold of traditionalism, engaging in a, how they put it, sacred battle against the morally corrupt, Satanist, and decadent West. All of this is done under the banner of Russian tradition, which the Kremlin, in close alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church, seeks to protect and advance as uniquely sacred and supreme. Some scholars equate these traditional values rigorously promoted by the current Russian regime with a Christian conservative idea of family values, while the recent decades coinciding with Putin's rule are indeed marked by Russia's powerful shift toward conservatism, lately in its reactionary forms. I don't believe that the recent instrumentalization or even fetishization of traditional values can be plausibly explained solely by Russia's embrace of Christian moral conservatism, inspired, how some Western scholars put it, by transnational influences. Russia's current obsession with traditional values appears to be a continuation of a long-standing Russian traditionalism, and as such is a homegrown phenomenon. Also, the concept may have some religious roots. Its use in contemporary Russia has effectively stripped it of any authentic religious meaning and significance, turning it into a blunt tool wielded by the Russian state. The term traditional values has been adopted by the Kremlin from the Russian Orthodox Church, mirroring its well-known concept of spiritual and moral values. Patriarch Kirill began incorporating the notion of traditional values into his speeches and writings as early as 2006-2007. Initially developed as a derivative of tradition, the word tradition, it was subsequently adopted for public use by a think tank organized at the behest of the Всемирный Русский Народный Собор, World Russian People Council, an international public organization and social forum founded in 1993. Tradition, in all its combinations and variations, became a central concept in the Russian Orthodox Church written and oral statements in the 2000s, constantly reiterated and expanded since then. The Orthodox understanding combines tradition in its general connotations with ecclesiastical canonical predania, traditional legends passed from generations to generations, signifying the inherent sum of texts, ideas, norms, and customs. Given that in the broader and more secular sense, tradition is primarily associated with morality, it is not surprising then that this particular use, how some scholars put it, has become the focus on the church presence in public debate. Some commentators, especially Western ones, even suggest that Patriarch Kirill seems to have personal commitment to the elaboration of a theological concept of the nature of morality. I'm somewhat doubtful that this judgment presents the situation correctly. The church leading role in moral matters may be more appearance than reality. The peculiar nature of the current alignment between the state and the church lies in the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church, with its consent, it is entirely subservient to the state's interest. Its autonomy is limited to formal matters related to the organization of church affairs, which have no significant impact on society's public space or the functioning of the state itself. In past decades, Putin has personally replaced the church as the primary symbol of Orthodox moral values, incorporating secular traditionalism into his domestic and foreign political agendas. It is merely that with this religious rhetoric, Putin evokes the long tradition of a great historical Russia he seeks to advance. In reality, however, the spiritual and moral values glorified by the regime are essentially detached from religion. In this regard, commentators rightly point out that the current invocation of traditional values in Russia is based on a completely secular view. The instrumentalization of religion with the consent of the Russian Orthodox Church is a crucial aspect of the contemporary Russian traditionalism that Putin's regime openly exploits to advance its aggressive Russophilic, anti-Western, and anti-liberal agenda. For decades, Putin has sought to present Russia as the champion of Christian values, showcasing Russian tradition as a guardian of true values necessary for human survival and progress. However, the values now promoted in Russia are far from universal. Instead, they are conceptually limited and culturally restricted. Unlike genuine values associated with modernity and future progress that embrace free enterprise, boundless initiative, and dynamic mobility in a variety of forms and appearances, the values Putin's Russia so vigorously protects promote submissive self-restriction, preservation of traditional practices and social roles, glorification of the past, and opposition to the future. A good way to keep the populace passive and obedient, the goal the regime pursues within the country. Putin's ambitions for Russia do not include the creation of anything new, nor does he aim to remake it in any productive way. Instead, his only program is returning to the strong and glorious Russia, which is destined for historical greatness, how he formulates it. Russian rulers' aims regarding their people have undergone little modifications since the Enlightenment period. Paradoxically, the primary premise, the spiritual and moral exceptionality of Russian tradition, has largely remained the same as its core. Changes mainly concern the means and ways of population control, becoming more sophisticated and skillful. In this process, both the history of Russia itself and the question of the culture and national identity of its people were subjected to instrumentalization. Appeals to spirituality and traditionalism are manipulated to bolster authoritarian agendas, quelling dissent and curtailing individual freedoms. A strong emphasis on traditionalism fosters a sense of Russian supremacy, marginalizing those divergent from dominant cultural norms and instrumentalized religious beliefs. It promotes ethno-nationalism, fueling xenophobia and anti-Western sentiments. The current Russian regime's fixation on tradition impedes social and political reforms, resisting necessary societal changes. This makes its agenda not just anti-modern and anti-progressive, but fundamentally counter-enlightenment and reactionary. In addition to adopting ethno-nationalist and anti-rationalist attitudes and displaying an aggressive anti-Western stance, the state under Putin's rule demonstrates hostility toward international cultural and educational institutions, animosity toward intellectuals who perceive their exercising independence and critical thinking, and neglect for genuine knowledge, science, and the arts. By promoting Russian traditionalism and values associated with this orientation, the regime openly opposes a range of ideals and practices that have been associated with the European Enlightenment, since the 17th and 18th century, substantially contributing to the making of the modern world. Resistance to those ideas and an openly antagonistic outlook characterize the contemporary Russian culture, political, and social landscape, which is saturated with resentment and hostility toward any form of diversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina. Now, question for Marina.
Thank you very much for your talk. I had two questions, and I had two more in my list, but I decided to limit myself with just this. First, it's about the Russian Enlightenment, which is certainly based upon two principal institutions, the academic sciences and the university. Both in its initial stage were a continuation of Western scientific and education system. Among first academicians, there were very few those who were born on the territory of empire, and they appeared only in the second half of the 18th century. One of them, Mikhail Lomonosov, struggled for the greater fraction of those who were on the territory of Russia, dominated it. And it was the case by the end of 19th century, the number of those who was born on the Russian territory dominated finally, but nevertheless, up until the end of 1920s, all Russian scientists got their education abroad in Western Europe. Nevertheless, I would relate the moment you mentioned to the time of equilibrium, to the balance, when the number of foreigners and number of Russians in the economy became equal. How can you comment this? This is my third question. And my second question is, I believe that this moment was approximately the 1820, or maybe a little bit later, and this is the moment which was very important in Russian history, because it's the moment when Jesuits were expelled from the Russian Empire. From the very beginning, Peter the Great was very hostile to the Orthodoxy, to Russian. It's well-known fact, and he was criticized, especially in the 19th century, especially exactly for that, exactly for his hostility to the Orthodoxy. At the same time, he was equally hostile to the Catholicism. And it was Catherine the Great who accepted the idea of Catholicism and who invited Jesuits from Western Europe when the society was suppressed. And St. Petersburg became a host for Jesuits. And then, after that, so the Catholic ideas became very attractive, and many representatives of Russian elite converted to Catholicism and approached the ideas of Jesuits. At this moment, at 1820, was the time when this Orthodox conservatism came forth, when it appeared on the political scene, and the all existence of educational and scientific institutions had to be in accordance in some kind of agreement with religions. So I would say, how would you comment these two perspectives? The role of scientific Europe in Russian scientific life, and the necessity to coordinate scientific activity with some specific religious institutions in the empire.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is really so great that you raise these questions, because it gives me an opportunity to expand a little bit so upon what I've said. So you probably figure out that this is only a portion of what I have, and I couldn't present the whole story. So obviously it's kind of just a summary, right? So first about the academy and the university, actually. So this is one of the ideas put forward by many scholars, and not only scholars, so intellectuals generally saying that the Enlightenment, so Russian Enlightenment, so that core of the Russian Enlightenment, so was actually education and promotion of science and so on. And it's obviously associated, and this is absolutely kind of real fact, right? Associated with the opening of the academy, so with establishment of the public education, and even public education not only for aristocracy, but also so for kind of simple people and so on. And perhaps two first kind of Russian scientists, so to say, yeah. So this is Lomonosov, Mikhail Lomonosov, who you name, but also Tatishev, This is another one around the same period, right? So they kind of influence the development of science and knowledge in Russia to the extent that they contributed by writing books, by developing some experiments, Lomonosov, for example, right? So, and also by being heard, so to say, so in a public sphere, right? The problem, however, so is, at least for me, that it started with Peter the Great. So actually, so Peter the Great was the first to bring this Western education into Russia. This is, we know this fact, it's well known in source story. And it was he who actually sent young Russians to the West, first to the Netherlands, right? So to learn how to build boats, because he was obsessed so with navy, so with creating this Russian float, so to say. But also, obviously, they were able, so these young Russians so sent to the West, so Netherlands and then Germany, so they were able to pick up some other cultural elements or educational elements. And when they came back, they could speak different languages. They could already, so not only to demonstrate some knowledge of skill, but also some knowledge of sciences and so on. Furthermore, and this is also very important, that initially it was the church, the official church, that introduced Western intellectual values into Russia, because it was orthodoxy, it was official church that got some materials or some text. So from the West, exported them, so they bought them. So they literally bought them, so for gold, they exported them into Russia. They started reading them and publishing about this text. So, and in this way, they were able to disseminate knowledge, so European knowledge, including, for example, so knowledge in natural sciences and some Cartesian ideas, so Descartes and so on, right? So presenting them and introducing them into Russian discourse. So yes, it was to some extent a paradoxical situation, because it seemed that kind of Russia was opening up, and this opening up was not only the kind of question of the economical opening or political to some extent, but also knowledge, science, and kind of turning toward the Western tradition and so on. However, and this is the problem, this is the paradox, because this Enlightenment was kind of introduced, and this is the peculiarity of Russian Enlightenment, so top down, so it was really put under the strong control. So knowledge and education, so both of them, they were allowed, but only to their degree. To the degree that won't challenge the Orthodox religion, so the faith, right? And won't challenge monarchy. So that was the thing. So if we look, for example, at Diderot, what Diderot wrote about Catherine the Great, because he was fortunate enough to be invited by Catherine the Great, who is considered to be the last monarch of the Enlightenment, right? And he had a number, numerous actually, so conversation with Catherine the Great about how kind of to proceed with Russia, what to do and how to introduce culture, Western culture into Russian tradition. So he was very critical of their course or the pathway that this development of knowledge, science, education took in Russia, right? And also, so he was very, very careful and critical of the political context within which this education was allowed up to the level. So this is one of the things here, so kind of putting it under the pressure and under the control. Now, in terms of the academy, yes, it was the period, right, when actually academy included, so half of the representative of the Western world, meaning scientists, and half of them, so they were kind of native people, but these native people, they were educated in the West. So actually, yes, so they were born in Russia, but they were educated in the West. And what they propelled in Russia, it was exactly the same mode of conversation and mode of development of culture and so on. Even before the revolution, this is the early 20th century, most of the professors at the Moscow University and St. Petersburg University, so they were either Germans that who settled in Russia, so they even changed their names, right? So, or they were educated or in Europe. And we also know that a lot of intellectuals, they went to Europe, more specifically to Marburg, for example, even Baden, this neo-Kantianism, right? So, but to Marburg, many of them, including Pasternak, right? So the writer, so they went there to get this education. And this is how these ideas, Western ideas, they were introduced in Russia. It's a paradoxical situation. So, and the paradox is that today, so Russia tries kind of to close the door completely, yeah? So this is isolation, complete isolation. This is what is propagated there. And Russia tries to say that we have unique knowledge, we have unique science, we have unique philosophy. So, and we don't want to have anything so with the Western tradition. It's impossible to talk about Russian culture, Russian intellectual tradition, Russian philosophy, so just taking it from the context of the European tradition. This is, for me at least, this is an absurd idea, right, by itself. Now, about the church and the influence of the church, right? I am not so sure I agree with your statement that Peter the Great so actually was critical toward orthodoxy and tried to kind of suppress it. What he did, in fact, so he wanted to have power even over the church. So all his reforms, including church reforms, religious reforms, so they were not kind of aimed at church or at religion. They were rather aimed at the official church in the sense that he wanted to prevent that the church prevails, that the church is above monarchy. He wanted to establish the situation that Russian monarchy so actually dictate the church, so official church, what to do and how to do. As a result, a lot of mandated rules, a lot of principles that were developed around that time and introduced around that time. So this, I would be very careful about, you know, so kind of falling into this trap that his reforms, so they were kind of anti-religious or anti-orthodox orthodoxy reforms. So he had his own interest, obviously, and the fallen monarchs are the same. Now, about this paradoxical situation again, so between orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, and Catholicism, yeah, so this is forcing back to some extent. It's also introduced so by some tradition associated with the church itself. So around that time, I forgot the exact name, but around that time, it was a kind of development that within the church as well, the development that tried to promote the idea of the unity within Christianity. So this is where kind of Orthodox tradition was introduced to some extent as a part or as a variation of Catholicism. And it was also a big discussion about that. So eventually it wasn't accepted, but the discussion was ongoing. And within this context, so we can probably read this history with Jesuits and some others who were introduced so into Russian discourse around that time. But I personally don't have the answer to this question. So Russia has a lot of kind of created a lot of puzzles that I don't know how to address, because many documents, they are very paradoxical to some extent, or contradictory to some extent as well, how to read them, right? So how to read this or that. Thanks.
Do you have another question? But what do you say few words about massive population of Russia? Now we are talking traditionally about Christian, but now we know that Russia one of the biggest population of Muslim people in Europe. What do you think? How this sorts of podcast and Putin help them to integrate Russia? What can we do with the situation?
Thanks for this question. It's a interesting, it's a kind of big question now, and I think that this question is also linked to another question: how to deal with immigrants, right? So immigrants from the former Soviet republics, so let's say so Kyrgyzstan, right? So Kazakhstan and some others. So not to mention obviously also some kind of Russian territories. Yeah, so historically Russian territories that also have this Muslim population, plus some other introduced a little bit later. Now, what is interesting though, so I don't know so how it's going to evolve, but I believe that one of the ideas of this concept now they introduced and very powerfully kind of put and promoted, right? So aggressively, I would say promoted in Russia. So this is civilization, yeah, so state civilization. So this particular concept is very unique because sometimes we don't pay attention to that, because what is promoted here is the idea of plurality, right? So it's not to say that they try to introduce Russia as the only single, right? So state civilization, they're saying that there are many other state civilizations, right? So, and this is the plurality of different civilization, let's say, so China, so Arabs, right? So Iranian civilization, for example, and Russia, one of them, right? What is the idea, at least how I read it? So the idea is not to kind of introduce Russia as a purely Russian state, right? So ethnically Russian state, but as a state which is multinational state, yeah, including so different nationalities, but also different religions, right? And this is the way kind of to unite all of them, right? So under this umbrella of the Russian world. So Russian world should not be read, or Russian civilization should not be read as a kind of ethnically Russian state of civilization. So this is a kind of wrong interpretation. It should be read as a Russian state as a whole that includes all these territories, all these regions, all these nationalities, all these religions, right? But there are some unique properties that are kind of exhibited here, and these unique properties, so this is a sign of the whole civilization. And I think that this is a kind of tool for the present regime to deal with this national question, right? Traditional national question as well, including the question of religious, because what Kirill lately said in his message, so how genuine this message is, who knows, but he said that we are all united in our faith. How to read it? I don't know. I'm skeptical about everything what this official church says, but this is the message. And I think that this is one of the attempts on their part.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have one question
What?
here.
This,
from my
Lyosha.
We have another question.
Yeah.
Yes,
1 minute.
Thank you very much for this rich presentation. I have one remark and one question. The remark pertains
Wait,
to...
wait, Losha, wait for a minute, please, because we're trying to do a little bit louder. We can read. Okay, now, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for this rich presentation. I have one remark and one question. The remark pertains to the opposition between Westernizers and Slavophiles. I would say it is an opposition that is often used in Russian studies, but I would say it is not always productive to use it to understand the current situation, specifically because the Russia's situation at the time was significantly different in comparison to Western countries, and so things that were said and written by Russian conservatives were not necessarily seen as anti-progressive, and were even by some people from the government seen as ultra-progressive, like the ideas on the necessity of judicial reform, which was the position of the Westernizers, but also the position of many Slavophiles. So they concurred on this point. So we have to take into account that the context was significantly different. There was no really enlightened monarchy in Russia, nor was there some kind of parliamentary monarchy, etc., etc. So I would be more cautious in this regard. And my question pertains to the contemporary perspective. It is certain, and you have demonstrated that the Russian Orthodox Church has much influence on the current political agenda, but there are also other groups that are contrary, whose agenda is contrary to the agenda of anti-progressivism or the spiritual traditionalists, etc. There are many who represent the technocratic view of Russia's development. I would say some kind of techno-progressivism, like in the biotechnological field. We see how obsessed the Russian government is with biotechnologies in the last few years, especially. So, and there are specific people with big positions that represent this camp, for instance, Mikhail Kovalchuk. So how would you characterize this coexistence of this anti-progressist camp and this technological or technocratic ultra-progressist camp? How does it come together in Russian politics of today? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alexei. So both questions, your remark and your questions are obviously very important here. So about your remarks, so I appreciate it, but I can say only one thing here. So one thing is how it's read or how it's interpreted from within, and especially within the context itself and within the historical period. And another thing is how actually we're able to interpret it, so viewing it, so from the perspective of the historical progression. So my approach was rather the second than the first, and this is how I actually try to reconstruct it. I should mention though, and I am aware of this difficulty as well, that sometimes it's not beneficial to try to reconstruct the historical progression as a linear progression, because obviously there is nothing like linear progression. I'm a Hegelian myself, and I know it very well. So actually, so this is just kind of a replica or remark in response to it. And again, I appreciate it. So the second one, I would be very careful here, especially when you speak of this biotechnology and some other technological kind of advances, or at least so search for technological advances in Russia. I would be very skeptical to the extent that there is a lot of kind of talk about it, but actually no result. So yes, so this Skolkovo Center was established in Russia in order to produce some new technology that could be sold, right? So to the West, right? But as a matter of fact, nothing was produced. Yeah, so it was just huge corruption. So money disappeared. Nobody knows where and how. Some money were paid. So for, again, the Western scientists, right? So to come there and do something for Russia, nothing happened. So this is why I think, honestly, that a lot of discussion about biotechnology coming from Russia, this is a kind of empty talk. So it's just a wishful thinking rather than a real result. So this is at least so my take on that, and there are many evidence, so we can discuss it later. So what evidence so I have in mind, so to claim that. And in this sense, yeah, so Russia is trying to play, so to say, yeah, so or pretend to be playing by the rules of the world. However, so is not playing by the rules, is just pretending, I mean, in terms of the technological development and so on. And the most important thing, so it's not able to do that. So it has limited capability, especially now because of, I'm not saying the lack of science or scientists, but because many of great scientists, they just left Russia. They are not in country anymore. And they are trying now also to boost this kind of science from within. And the only thing that they can do is to pay more people, you know, in this research institution, but without providing any right environments for the development of science. But we can discuss it further. So this is at least so my approach and my take. So what I observe, maybe to some extent from without rather than from within, but I am really very skeptical about the advances, except maybe kind of military things. So this is where they use some technology, but as far as I know, this technology is pretty old. So they just recuperate, so the old machines, the old, you know, so tanks, old equipment, and they just reproduce it what was produced before. Russia now is even behind in cosmos. So traditionally, it was one of the Russian advancements, but not anymore. Look at what Musk is doing, and not only Musk is not alone. So many other companies now, they compete with each other. Unfortunately for Russia, fortunately for all of us, because so this is the world progress. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we are finishing, and thank you everybody for participating in our discussion.